Great. So hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I'm pleased to introduce Jeffrey Chi, a policy advisor with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, with background in from UBC, specializing in global environmental politics and global health diplomacy. He has spent over 8 years working on ecosystem-based adaptation, climate change, multilateral climate and biodiversity negotiations at local, national, and global levels. His work has taken him to the UN climate change negotiations, other key international climate forums. So today, Jeffrey will share his personal journey into climate policy, insights into multilateral climate negotiations, and pathways for getting involved in this field. So please welcome Jeff.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for coming during your lunch hour and hear me yap about for like an hour. I think I need to talk for like 30 minutes. So you got bear with my beautiful voice for 30 minutes, and then you can ask any questions you might have. Just want to do a sound check. Can you hear me okay? There's no mic in this room. Okay, perfect. I have a tendency to speak really fast. So if I ever start doing that, just raise your hand and let me know, and I will try to slow down a little bit. Cool. Yeah, so thanks so much for the introduction. I'm Jeffrey. I'm currently a policy advisor with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. It's a mouthful, IISD for short. I got my bachelor's and master's degrees here at UBC, both in political science and international relations. My thesis was on global environmental politics, how environmental norms kind of spread around in international negotiations, and kind of why do they matter in today's environmental negotiations. I also did a little bit of research on global health diplomacy, so really timely subject matter because I graduated during the pandemic, and I hope you guys never have to experience that ever again. So what else? Yeah, so just gonna talk a little bit about what we do at ISD, what I do at ISD, and sort of talk a little bit about, in general, kind of what's it like to have a career in international climate diplomacy, and what's it like to work for like a research think tank. And then feel free to ask any questions you might have. Cool. What else is there? Let's see if this works. It does. Cool. So anyone here heard about ISD before? Oh, there's a lot of people. Yeah, so we actually do have a lot of IRES alumni at ISD. Professor Sarah Elder is one of our senior policy advisors working for our economic law and policy program. She works mainly on agriculture and standards, I want to say. It's mainly just like, fair trade labels, what kind of standards you have for your agricultural practices, and what you get to kind of, label as sustainable. So she works for that. But I work for the resilience program. So in short, we were founded in 1988 in response to the Rio Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. We were funded by the Canadian government as kind of a center to think about sustainable development issues. So back then, it was actually created by a conservative prime minister. That's kind of the old school conservative environmentalism types of things that went on for like the 1980s. But right now, after 30 some years, we've expanded and started doing all sorts of different things on sustainable development. So I can go through briefly about what we do at the resilience program and maybe give you an overview on what other program does, which you might be interested in. So for resilience program, we work mainly on climate change adaptation and biodiversity. So climate adaptation is, I'm not sure if you've heard of this before, but it's like adapting to climate change impacts, trying to understand what risks there are in terms of our changing climate and how people and biodiversity are vulnerable to those climate risks. And we understand them, and we try to build government's capacity and institutional systems to address these risks and vulnerabilities. So all in all, we just, preparing communities, preparing ecosystems to better adapt to our changing climate and a very uncertain future as well. So that's mainly what we do. In the resilience program, we help developing countries mainly with their national adaptation planning process. So it's a process under the UN Climate Change Convention on kind of how to actually build your system capacity or putting legislation, putting regulation, putting plans to adapt. So we help developing countries do that. The rest of the programs, they do trade laws, they do subsidy reform, they do fossil fuel phase outs work and energy transition. Some of them are in Indonesia, some of the work are in South Africa. But all in all, we have projects in over 100 different countries in the world. And most of them are somewhat related to climate change or on sustainable trade. So yeah, what else is there? We're based in Winnipeg, in Manitoba. It's an interesting choice, but there's a lot of international development organizations in Winnipeg. And we have offices in Ottawa, Toronto, and Geneva. But we have 300 staff working all over the world. So including myself, working remotely from here in Vancouver. We are a Canadian organization. I feel like I need to mention that after what's happening this week. And we are the largest think tank in Canada by the amount of people who work for us and also our annual revenue number, which is roughly $55 million in budgets every year. But yeah, they work around the world. I just want to quickly mention about ELA because it's a really interesting stuff. And if you're a sciencey person, which I'm not, you might find it interesting. We manage 56 small lakes and watersheds in Northern Ontario on behalf of the Canadian government. They are individual, like these lakes are similar in terms of ecosystem and biozone, but they are not connected in any way, shape, or form. So it's a perfect place to do controlled experiments. If you want a sample, like a control size and also a actual experimental area. So one of the cool things they do is they dump a bunch of new technology or new ways to clean up oil spills. So for example, they kind of dump bunch of oil into one lake and try different ways, try to clean up. So to simulate what happens in real life if there's an oil spill. So we have a bunch of hydrologists, biologists, and a bunch of scientists who work in Northern Ontario during the summer to conduct these experiments. So if you're ever interested, you can also visit there. It's in Kenora in Northern Ontario, and you can book a tour there. Or if you have a scientific research idea you want to propose, ELA is the place to go for freshwater research in Canada. Cool. What else is there? I feel like I've yapped about ISD a lot. Yeah, so what do we do? I mean, think tank is a very interesting kind of thing because it's not necessarily an NGO. Well, it is an NGO, but it doesn't do advocacy work like Greenpeace or WWF. But it's also not a consulting company. We're not a private sector company, even though we do work with clients. So our clients are usually the Canadian government, different countries' governments, the United Nations, or different foundations. And we receive our funding through these governments and foundations, and sometimes private sector, to work on different projects. And usually all these projects have some research component to it. And that's what makes us a think tank. The people what we do is research, but at the end of the day, we also work on different projects. So I'm trying to summarizing kind of what my day would look like if I'm not traveling for work. It's usually writing, it's usually kind of hosting webinars or like doing these kind of talks, or somehow influencing policies and public opinion. So a lot of the, I think 60% of my time are spent on researching, basically what you do here at UBC, but also writing different reports. If people read them, I don't know. If anyone ever reads them, I sometimes don't even read the report I write, but 60% of the time is spent on writing reports. And usually these reports are from, ranging from case studies to policy briefs to explaining kind of what's happening in international negotiations and how that's relevant for your government, for your company, for your kind of little sector. A lot of these are sort of, how to say, coming from our lived experience or work experience in developing countries or in different project sites, trying to summarize some of the lessons learned, some of the best practices, and share them with other governments or other kind of organizations. So we can all kind of build a community of practice. The second is we do a lot of capacity building. fundamentally, we're still a research kind of organization, and a lot of the, how do I say this? Countries in similar situations often face similar challenges, and sometimes the solution is the same, but governments don't really necessarily talk to each other about these very technocratic or technical stuff. So we are the knowledge broker who kind of provides these services to connect different governments, to share their experiences, to kind of understand what the problem is and how we might solve it, and then try to kind of publicize it. The other format of this is public capacity building. What's happening at the international level is super complicated, it's super confusing. So we try to make sense of what's being discussed in international negotiations and basically educate the public on climate change, on sustainable development, on all of these very complex topics. Whether some people listen to us, that's a different story. The other part of this is kind of influencing public policy. And that's, I think, what separates us from a consulting company. Because we do compete, think tanks do compete with a lot of your management consultants. So Deloitte, McKinsey, BCG, they're all in the same area. They also advise governments on different policies, on different kind of projects. But what separates us from them, apart from low salary and no profits, is we genuinely try to influence good policy. We're advocating for something called social good, or something that might be considered as genuinely good to the governments. These take the shape of reports that we submit to parliaments for different committee hearings. These might be lobbying efforts for Canada to phasing out fossil fuels or good ways to phase out fossil fuels. These might be submitting different inputs, opinions, knowledge to different negotiations at the multilateral level, trying to shape the future of climate diplomacy. So these are some of the sort of things that we usually do. We also do a whole bunch of other stuff, but feel free to poke around our website and you can learn more about over 200 different projects that we're doing around the world. How are we doing on time? Oh, doing good. Cool. So what do I actually do in my job? I split my time on two different things. On one part, it's called nature-based solutions and advancing synergies between climate and biodiversity. So anyone heard about nature-based solutions before? Everyone? Perfect. If you haven't heard about it, it's harnessing the power of nature to solve societal issues, whether it's climate change, biodiversity decline, or public health issues. And our work on nature-based solutions is mainly trying to mainstream it to different governments and to set the standard to make sure your nature-based solution interventions are actually following science, are actually gender responsive, trying to promote gender equality and social inclusion in the different local communities, but also respect the human rights of the local community and especially indigenous peoples. There's a lot of different standards and guidelines in terms of how you actually plan and implement a nature-based solution, but a lot of them are very confusing. So we break them down and then try to help different governments, national or subnational governments, to implement these projects and to plan genuinely good nature-based solutions for implementation. Synergy, this idea of a synergy between climate and biodiversity might be very intuitive for folks who especially study at IRES. Climate change exacerbates biodiversity decline, and biodiversity decline also exacerbates climate change. It seems very intuitive, but in reality and in policy making, countries, it's often siloed between different teams. Biodiversity team focus on their biodiversity conservation efforts. Climate change focuses on their own mitigation, adaptation stuff. So more and more, I think over the past couple of years, countries are kind of taking note of this and trying to use nature-based solutions as a way to bridge the divide between their biodiversity policies and their climate change policies. Oftentimes, it's really just getting the people to talk to each other about what they're actually doing. And a lot of times, we do find that you can save a lot of money by doing this because you're not implementing the same activity twice. You're not creating new metrics for monitoring, evaluation, and learning. when you already have those data. Or you are not doing climate risk and vulnerability assessment twice because they're very expensive and they're very complicated to do. So if you can integrate biodiversity assessment into your climate risk and vulnerability assessment, that's a way to help you to save time, save money, but also save the very limited human resources that some countries have, right? Because sometimes it's literally just two people in a government that works on climate biodiversity. For example, the case of St. Lucia, it's just two random grad students who was in charge of the entire country's climate plan, right? So they do face a lot of challenge, and pursuing this synergy can help you achieve better policy and achieve better results, but also save you time, money, and capacity. So that's kind of half of my time is spent on that. The other half is on the, I think, more interesting stuff is the international negotiations. So ISD, we are a observer organization to the UN climate change negotiations, so UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Everyone heard about Paris Agreement, I assume? Everyone, perfect. And do people know what we do every year at those COP conferences, the annual UN climate change conference? Anyone want to share? What do you think we do usually?
What ISD does, or generally?
In general, what countries are doing?
Negotiating some of the follow-up on the Paris Agreement, lots of damages, things that.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so just for the Zoom, the answer is kind of, following up on Paris Agreement, talking about different areas that's remaining there. Absolutely, that's kind of a part of it. That's usually what it's intended to do. Countries are there to negotiate new international laws in terms of climate change. And those laws are subsidiary to the Paris Agreement, essentially. Every year, countries reach different decisions, and those decisions take effect in the form of international law. So they are legally binding. Some of the stuff are not legally binding, but most of them are. Countries do have to follow up. Countries have reports they need to submit. Countries discuss the progress and what more needs to be done. But more and more, I think if I go to like an undergrad class and ask this question, people would say, you guys make speeches and very lousy commitments, but there's nothing actually happening. And you might also hear news about oil companies sign oil deals. They're all true because COP in recent years have become more like a trade show than what's actually mandated to do. So more and more often you go to COPs, you can see all the negotiators and all the international negotiation stuff happening in a separate, smaller conference area. And the entire conference venue is more like a trade show, right? It's different pavilions, it's different booths for companies and countries to showcase their climate action. But sometimes it's also, oil and gas deals in the case of Azerbaijan or in the case of Dubai. So it's becoming more polarizing, and people start asking the question of why are we shipping 100,000 people to Dubai for a climate change conference? But fundamentally at its core, there is still value to the multilateral process. But the Paris Agreement is the only international agreement on climate change we're going to get in this century. It's a self-renewing agreement. It will not expire. Countries continuously to pledge new commitments under the Paris Agreement. So a lot of the current discussion is on finance. So developing countries do need to emit to develop at the current kind of technological progress. And they do need money to implement some of the climate mitigation and adaptation, especially adaptation work they want to do. So how do you equitably transfer wealth from the global north to the global south, but also ensuring accountability, making sure the money is actually going into climate action projects instead of something else, like arms deals, for example. So COP exists, a forum for countries to discuss what more needs to be done in terms of climate action, what has happened, sharing their best practices, sharing kind of what their countries are doing and what good practices they may have. And also serve as an accountability mechanism to call out countries that are failing at their climate commitments and trying to see what more the international community can actually do to help these countries to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. So when you go to COPs, ISD as a think tank, we do a lot of different things. I think one is we observe and we try to like understand the process and explain to decision makers, to the private sector and to the general public on what's actually happening, and dissect the whole process so more people can understand what's happening and what's the current debate on climate change is. That takes the form of, the different reports that we write, different newsletter, the different webinars that we hold during and after COP, trying to kind of discuss what does all of these decisions mean for your industry, for your life, and for your government as well. The other big part we do is trying to translate some of our knowledge into actionable policies. Because we work in over 100 different countries, both developing and developed countries, we have a lot of experience in terms of what climate action actually looks like on the ground and what actually work and what doesn't. And I think the question of doesn't work is the more interesting one, because you don't want to waste your effort on something that just does not work. And sharing these kind of failures is also a part of the kind of international discussion on climate change. We try to make submissions. We try to influence what topic are being discussed at these negotiations and how countries are framing around the issues, right? So there are a lot of, I want to come up with an example, but I can't really think of any. Let's just take the biodiversity, climate biodiversity synergy as an example. We know it's the good thing to do. We know it's the right thing to do, and lots of countries are doing it. But maybe it's just you don't have an agenda item to bring it up under your normal negotiation process. What we will do is to kind of make a submission, to talk to different countries, trying to add a paragraph on biodiversity, on why biodiversity is important in the grand scheme of climate action. Trying to suggest different languages that they can use to acknowledge the importance of biodiversity, to acknowledge the importance of synergy, and hoping that countries will kind of take it up in the future. So that's one way that we can shape the conversation and trying to spotlight areas that, are neglected in some way. So that's kind of just like our influencing public policy parts of our job. The third one is kind of what I work on the most, is advising different countries on their negotiations. So we advise, for example, Canada on what Canadian government should negotiate or what their priority should be, what they should focus on during these negotiations. And the one thing you should know about negotiators is there are poli-sci students like me who aren't really well-versed in the science or in kind of specific areas. We are all very good negotiators, but we need subject matter experts to tell us exactly what we're negotiating on. So I serve to kind of advise on specific issues. Negotiators, sometimes they are trade negotiators. Sometimes they come from different branches, so they might not always work on climate change. So our job is to keep them up to date on what's actually happening, what other countries' positions are, and if they have any questions about more technical issues. For example, how do you actually synergize climate and biodiversity on a national level? What are the different policy instruments you can actually use to achieve that? We are able to provide that answer really quickly. So usually you see me sitting at the back behind negotiators so they can ask me questions if they ever need to. And we serve that kind of role to advise on countries on what they should actually do and what's the good policy to kind of put forward, right? Because a lot of times when you are negotiating for your country, you have red lines that are given to you by your minister. Your countries have your particular interest, your countries have particular priorities that you want to advance. For Canada, it's Indigenous people's rights and gender equality. So you'll see every Canadian negotiator advocating for those 2 points in negotiations. But you might not be, so if something new happens, something like, a new topic, a new idea that was proposed, and you're not really sure what is, or how kind of that aligns with your national interests, we are able to kind of provide that very quick assessment and tell negotiators, this is your position, this should be kind of what you're advocating for. So hopefully that makes sense. Been blabbering on a lot for a little while now. I have 4 minutes left, I think. Okay, cool. I have a whole thing on kind of, talking about the career path and what's next in this area. I first got into UN climate negotiation in 2017, and not a lot of people know about climate change back in 2017, and certainly not a lot of people care about this area. But that all changed after Greta Thunberg and movement, and now more and more people actually know about climate change, know about the process, are willing to do something about it. So I think there's a general shift in kind of this industry. We've seen opportunities over the last more private sector engagement as well. But certainly we are affected by what's happening south of the border in the most recent months. I prepared this whole thing, but I think I'm just gonna talk, blabber on. So if I become very not logical, bear with me. We are in a very terrible time. I'm not gonna lie to you. In terms of job market, in terms of countries' commitments to sustainable development, to climate action, USAID and US State Department fund $60 billion of international development aid around the world, and a lot of them are on climate change. A lot of them do come to organizations like us, think tanks, research organizations, and NGOs, and we're all affected by this. The trade war or Europe's shift to defense, they all have an impact on international development. And it's very likely that organizations like us will get less and less money in the future from governments. And we all have to rely more on foundations, rely more on private donors, rely more on the private sector to fill that role. But at the same time, we've been through this before, right? Bush, Harper, all of the governments before, like these funding shifts happen. And usually this sector is very resilient and this sector survives. But it just means that temporarily for the next 4 or 5 years, you might see less job opportunities on climate change. They might be renamed to something else. Climate change adaptation is no longer climate change adaptation. It's about disaster risk reduction. No one can deny the fact that wildfire is going to ravage us again this summer. But it might not just be caused by climate change. It might just be something else. So you'll see a lot of these kind of name shifting happening. Companies will continue to do their energy transition because it's the cheaper thing to do in the long run. It makes more sense in some remote areas that, let's just use mining as a example. It's easier to get electricity in rural area than shipping a whole bunch of fuel or gas up there. So we see a big shift in EV demand in the mining sector, that companies are doing that energy transition, but they might no longer call it climate change mitigation. It's just, it makes good business sense, right? ESG might no longer be called ESG, it's just resilience. So you might see a lot of these kind of name shifting. And I think that's the kind of big lesson is be adaptable. You want to leverage your transferable skills to be adaptable in this like terrible times. And also, don't give up. I know it's a cliche thing to say, but the jobs will come back, the opportunities will come back, the funding will certainly come back. Still very much invested in climate action, and countries are committed to do this. Not just because, like they have to under the Paris Agreement, but it's genuinely impacting their economy. Climate change will have an impact on all sectors across the board. So look out for different types of opportunities as well. Private sector is now more and more involved in this area. even though your first kind of instinct or first choice might not be Deloitte or these kind of consulting companies, but they do a lot of cool work alongside of the atrocities that they commit. But they still do a lot of advising work for governments. They do a lot of climate change work and climate adaptation work as well. So those are the opportunities that you might want to look into for the next couple of years as the public sector kind of winds down with our recruitment and start laying off people. So that's kind of, I don't know, might be too pessimistic of a view to share, but I do feel like you have to be mentally prepared for that. And when I graduated, it was the pandemic. There was kind of a hiring freeze in the nonprofit sector. It took me 6 months to find my current job after hundreds of rejection letters, right? So it's okay to take a little bit of a time to kind of find new opportunities. And it's also okay to hate your first job out of grad school, right? We all take different paths to get to where we are. And I think sometimes it's okay to drag it out in the private sector for a little while and then go back to the area that you actually want to work in. And try to be resilient in your own work, in your own research, and in your own life as well. And it's okay to take a little break. Times are tough right now, and I see my colleagues who work on the US side dragging their hair out every single day. So it's okay to feel anxious. It's okay to feel kind of, I have no time left. So all in all, like, it's okay to grow at your own pace, build your own network, and also be pragmatic with your choice in terms of policy research or your ask or your any aspects. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there and open to any questions you might have, things I missed. Also, this back.